My name's Grant Emeny Smith. I work for Cisco in the US for the IASBU, Intelligent Automation Solutions business unit, which most people think of Cisco as a hardware company. It also is, like a lot of companies, it's trying to move into integrated architectures. So this is more of the application space that sits on top of hardware and exploits the hardware. You always have to start with some form of vision. What's possible, what's desirable, what's aspirational in this space. And I think really the challenge for cities is to say, just as Apple basically turned the phone market on its head, it took this sort of siloed, fragmented experience and said, no, if we put the hardware and the software into an integrated stack, tell people how to develop on it, and then make it all about the user experience and all about the content, we will win. And they did. And the key thing to attract, there is developers, right? Well, why is Apple beating Android in the sort of user experience space? Why is Microsoft struggling? Basically, they struggle to attract the development community to build and exploit the infrastructure stacks that are in place. They've broadly all got the same capabilities. Even from an SDK standpoint, they've broadly got the same capabilities. The only difference is there's a vast number of developers on one side and they're not on the other. So one of the key challenges for cities as they move into this sort of digital space is attracting, retaining developers. Part of that is the point and the reason of the platform underneath it. And I think that clearly, as is already happening but will happen more, just as cities are scored on their transport experience, their health experience, their whatever experience, at some point they're going to get scored on their digital experience. How easy is it to get digital services inside a city, whether that's as a citizen or as an enterprise, as a tourist? All of those things will suddenly become part of the why should I go to London as opposed to Paris or New York? How much does it cost for me to get those services in those places? So the challenge here really is saying, okay, if you build these types of sort of digital platforms inside cities, how do you use them to optimize sort of service delivery? How do you use them to create opportunities for service innovation? And how do you allow that sort of co-creation experience to occur? If you look at it from, there's really two ways to look at this. There's sort of saying, okay, what does a city get out of it? What do people who are actually part of a city want from this thing? So there's a demand actually within cities. Cities are just as poor, the city departments are just as poor at exploiting the digital assets they have as people outside. There's siloed information sitting inside. There's open data, means open to everybody, which means that people actually operate the city as well as the people that use the city. So there's a benefit for the departments if this is done well. City residents obviously want to gain a much more optimized and experience with their city. They want highly automated and flexible solutions. They want on-demand solutions. I don't want to have to put my bin out on a Wednesday night if there's nothing in it, or if it's the third full. I'd rather wait and put it out next week and pay just for that one collection every 2 weeks as to pay for the collection every other week. And there are cities that are beginning to put sonic sensors on the top of garbage cans to measure the fullness. Now, typically that's done for commercial collection, not for individual residential collection, but eventually it will move into those sort of spaces. And then for enterprises, there's a way to be better informed and engage in policy. If somebody's going to come and dig up, if I'm a business sitting on a public square somewhere in Europe, in Barcelona or wherever, big tourist city, if they're going to come and do some form of urban renewal, public furniture renewal within that space, I need to know. I need to know what the impact is going to be on my business. If I typically would put cafe chairs and tables out, I can't do that for 3 days. I should know about that. I should know that sufficiently in advance. I can either make a plan for it or object to it in some sense. We talked about service co-creation. So service co-creation really, as I said, the developers need something where they can create value. And they want that process of creating value to be as friction-free as possible, but also to be as expressive as possible. So again, one of the things I think Apple has managed to do on the iOS platform is make that developer experience much more rewarding in the broadest of senses than doing similar things on a Google platform where you've got 52 variants of Android to worry about. It's not a right once. So there are certainly some challenges around how much control or uniformity is desired in terms of these sort of open systems. Open systems can sometimes mean fragmented and splintered systems, right? Which actually is of no benefit to anybody, particularly if you're trying to do it for free out there. Service providers, you want to be able to monetize. You want to be able to govern the behavior of those developers in some sense. What's the delivery model for this open data? Is it, okay, every city has to become a data center operator, it has to become a public data center operator, it has to become a service provider? Or do you actually go and buy this from BT? Or do you buy it from some local partner? What's the delivery model around that? And then consumers, typically the most common experience is a sort of store experience, right? So am I going to go to a store to get these new experiences? And who runs that store? And what types of stores? Do I go get them from Amazon? Will there be a dominant city app player out there? Will it be the Apple experience where there's a highly managed store, a closed store? So there's lots of questions around what's the right sort of experience that people are wanting from this. But again, really from a developer standpoint, you want to encourage them to innovate, you want to encourage them to be loyal, and you need to provide them some way of generating revenue from that. Otherwise, it's a hobby, right? And that's the trouble with open data in London at the moment. It's essentially people's hobby. It's not their real job. It's their half-time job. It's their third-time job. It's their night-time job. But it's essentially a hobby. It's not a business. Okay, if you look, I work for Cisco. Why is Cisco engaged in this? So Cisco has recently put a whole ton of marketing around this, the Internet of Everything. And I'll let you read those statements up there if you want, but it's sort of there. How do you move from the Internet of Things to the Internet of Everything? And it's really, as the lower one says, it's really about the sort of convergence and intelligence and orchestration. It's sort of exposing what was hidden in the network to be visible on the network. It's exploiting the characteristics of the traffic flowing across the network, all those sorts of things. So that's sort of Cisco's involvement. That's why Cisco is interested in this. It sees the urban environment as being, the biggest sort of networks that are out there, the richest networks. That's where that sort of ability to exploit traffic is going to come from. iCity, this is a statement from iCity's mission statement. And as Nick mentioned earlier, iCity is a European Commission funded project. Runs for 3 years. It's just into its second year now. But primarily, it's about saying, we want to foster co-creation of services. It's not about saying, you as City Hall should create more services and do a better job. It's about saying, no, you should create a system in which other people can do that for you that are out there. So this is how Cisco sort of talks about its Internet of Everything sort of framework. It talks about people, process, data, and things. And again, I won't dwell too much, but from a things point of view, we literally mean anything. We don't just mean a computer, a router, a switch. Anything that's connected to, anything that's considered to be a resource on the network is considered to be a thing that should be connected to other things that are out there. The iCity framework tends to use these terms, infrastructure. And again, typically when they talk about infrastructure, they're really talking about sort of city furniture. Kiosks, bikes, sensors, cameras, actuators of one form and another that are out there. They tend to care less about systems, but I think systems also, internal systems, permitting systems, licensing systems, all of those things are network-attached resources that can be made available from there. But again, the key thing here is their sort of developer. It's really a sort of dance they want to promote between developers and citizens out there. How can you get the developers to do something of value to the citizens? Clearly, there's lots of parallels between those two sort of views of the sort of journey that we're on, and that's clearly why Cisco is sort of engaged in it. Okay, well, brings about a lot of change. And if you look on the challenges side, I won't say too much about this, but clearly the obvious one is scale, right? If you look at enterprises, they have hundreds of thousands of devices attached to their networks if they're big enough. Small business obviously clearly doesn't do that, but hundreds of thousands. If you look at service providers, Comcast is, if anybody's familiar with sort of cable networks in the States, Comcast is one of the biggest providers of cable TV and cable internet in the States. They probably have about 20 million. So they move from the sort of 100,000s to the tens of millions out there. When you talk about taking all the devices potentially that are in a city, and that means the devices that you and I walk around with, the devices that are in a street, the vehicles that are in a street, the lights, individual lights that are in buildings and on streets, you suddenly get this whole step jump from tens of millions, certainly into hundreds of millions, and into billions, right? So that promotes a whole bunch of other questions, which is, okay, what's the technology to deal with that scale? And again, that's a big challenge for companies like Cisco, saying, well, over-the-top IP is probably not going to work for that. So what's the right networking technology, and then how do you pull that networking technology up to expose the devices that are underneath that? How do you deal with security, particularly when a lot of these devices are moving? They're not fixed. They're not even tethered to anything. They're moving around. So how do you move a security context with a person that's walking along a street, they're down in a tube station, they're on a tube, they come up a tube, they're in a building, they go home. All of that stuff has to sort of follow them around. Certainly there's questions about liberty and personal freedoms and the rights of organizations to collect and use data. One of the biggest challenges that we've been facing is really a lack of public policy in this space. What is the purpose of a digital city? Is it to create growth? Is it to generate revenue? Is it to make the lives of people living in that city easier in some sense, simpler in some sense? I can only come into work 2 days a week, don't have to come in 5 days a week. Whatever it is, political challenges around that. If you turn that around on the other side, sort of opportunities, what are the opportunities that can create? Well, certainly there's opportunities around innovation, as we talked about. I think one of the important things, and again, I think this is going to be driven by developers as much as anybody, is saying there are new patterns. Every city in Europe you look at has a city bike scheme of some description out there. Well, at some point there's going to be some pattern, some solution pattern's going to develop around city bikes. And so if I write an application that works in London, it should work in Barcelona, it should work in Bologna, it should work in New York. How close are we going to, how long is it going to take to get to that sort of story? Revenue seems to always be a tricky thing. There's, I think it was stated in one of the sessions this morning in the other lab that, this is public data, it should be free. We've paid for it. Well, that won't work. That's never motivated anybody to do anything, is it's free, right? There's nothing in it for developers. So what's the right model here? Is it a sort of Apple-type model, which is a revenue co-share? So yeah, the data's free, but if you build something that uses it, then we want some slice of that money. Now, by we, I mean the city or the service provider or whoever is sort of participating in that value chain that's out there. So I think those are interesting questions about what's the revenue, what's the motivation from a financial standpoint, particularly if you're asking third parties to deliver applications out here. Mobility I touched on earlier. Things are moving around. It's a highly dynamic system. How do you deal with that, and what opportunities does that give you? Because you can move things around. You can actually not only react to the fact that things are moving around, you can move things around. You have the means to say, well, that bus shouldn't go there. It should go over here. Routes can become dynamic as opposed to fixed, because it knows where the traffic is. It knows where the demand is that's out there in some sense. Greenness. Clearly one of the opportunities for large enterprises is to monitor and measure and operate their businesses in such a way that their demand on city services is better managed. It's not flat. It's not between 9 and 5 we do this. Between 5 and 10 we do this. It just reacts much more dynamically. And I think the last one around sort of freedom, I talked about the, there's this book, this guy called Doug Ruskoff just wrote in the States. He calls it Present Shock, after the sort of Future Shock book. And one of the arguments he makes here is saying that, everyone's been talking about the sort of post-industrial sort of cycle. He'll make the argument that we've never left the industrial age. The industrial age was all about growth and acceleration. And all that's happened over the last 50 years is we're still chasing growth and acceleration. We work harder, faster, longer. And so one of the opportunities here is to say, well, what is the point of this digital city? What's the human benefit that we want to get out of this? Is it just more growth? Is it just accelerated working habits? I think there's sort of big challenges in that sort of area that come out of this as well. So let's talk a little bit about open data and sort of open infrastructure. So the viewpoint that we take is, open data is sort of talked about as though it's sort of solution or whatever, but it's really not. It's just an integration pattern. It's about saying, how should somebody integrate with some resource somewhere that's out there? What's the means for me to consume something that somebody else has produced? And that's the sort of second point there. It's really about this producer-consumer sort of dance. There are systems in the city that are producing data. Me as a consumer, whether I'm an application or a citizen or something else, I need to consume that. And open data is the integration tier that lets me get that. And really that comes on to the last point. Often you hear people talk about saying, we can't really have open data till we get open infrastructure. Well, it's really the other way around. Sort of open infrastructure is a consequence of having open data. Because in order to even locate infrastructure, you need to have data about it. And then you want to be able to operate it, you want to be able to task it, you want to be able to read it. And as I hinted at before, the challenge at the moment, I think, is as I said, at this point, it's been a sort of exploration, a little bit of a sort of hobby exercise, some of this stuff. Solution patterns will really be the key to actually getting this thing into widespread adoption. I want to be able to write a bike app that works in every city. How do I do that? That's my motivation. If I'm only earning a cent per transaction, well, I want it in every city in the world that is capable of supporting it, not just in London. That's out there. Okay, so we need to enable the producers. And again, we sort of talk about, again, I'm not going to talk about all the elements on this slide up here, but clearly there's resources. There's resources that are cameras, systems, sensors, from different manufacturers. A Schneider noise sensor doesn't work the same way as a Philips noise sensor. A Philips light bulb that's digital doesn't work the same way as an XYZ light bulb that's difficult. So there's a ton of challenges just down in the resource domain. But one of the benefits of this sort of the IOE platform and the IOE story is, to some degree, that's abstracted away from the developer. It's part of what the platform does. Is it says, if it's a smart light bulb, it's a smart light bulb. It does these three things. You can turn it on, you can turn it off, you can turn it up, you can turn it down. So there's a sense of needing to do this. You need to be able to discover and manage those resources. And we talk about that in a number of sort of modes, but three sort of primary modes, which is the system needs to know when something's attached to the network, whether that's a transient attachment, like a mobile phone attached to a tower, or whether it's something permanent and static, like a smart light bulb that's turned on, switched into the network. You need to be able to fingerprint that thing to prove that it is what it claims to be. It is a light bulb. It's not a system in Russia that's trying to control your energy system that's out there. So there's a need to basically fingerprint and continue to monitor the behavior of those devices to say, first it looked like a light bulb and it's continuing to behave like a light bulb. That's out there. So you have challenges just on the discovery side of it. You may need to be able to configure it. You may want to push an agent to it. Most of these devices, in a sense, are plugged into some sort of gateway devices. So those gateways essentially react as remote and distributed aggregators. So again, one of the ways of dealing with the scale here is that essentially you move into a mesh-based architecture, where there's lots of interconnected nodes and aggregators and gateways out there. So once you know about these devices, you configured them, decided you permitted people to talk to them, you really have two things that you want to do. You want to be able to read data off them, which may be reading data directly off the devices, ticks, noise sensor tick, noise sensor tick, or reading data from more complex systems. So for example, camera systems, yes, you can read the live feed off a camera, but more often than not, you have smart cameras that do onboard analytics, and what you're more interested in is the picture changed. There was nothing there, there is something there. There was something there, there's no longer something there. So it's those sorts of events. Now you've got some interesting event that's occurred, you correlated that against other interesting events, decided you want to do something, you now need to be able to task that device. And I think this is certainly the area where you get into the biggest, oh my God, what world are we venturing into from a sort of city governance point of view that says, are we going to allow a developer sitting in his bedroom to control that camera that's up there, that's sitting looking down on Trafalgar Square or wherever? Because that's the ultimate sort of, open infrastructure at some point says you should allow people to have control over these devices. So there's governance issues about that. There's what type of control do you allow them to have? How long do you allow them to have control? There's a notion of a lease wrapped up in this. I can have control, but for a certain amount of time under certain conditions. And then there are preemption policies. You may have control of that camera, but I want to give it to that guy because he's either paying me more money, or it's the police, and the police say they need to have control of that camera for some incident that's going on there. So there's lots of complexity wrapped up in this sort of task management side. Then as you go above that, you get into things like telemetry storage. So you've got all this data pouring off these systems. Where's it going to go? Well, most often than not, if it's a relatively simple device, the platform has to store it somewhere. So there has to be some storage mechanism there. If it's a more complex system like a camera system, there's usually the device comes with its own management system. So the data resides off of the platform, but you need to have access to it. So this is not a sense of saying all the data in the world has to pour down this big funnel. More often than not, all the data is going to be elsewhere, and it's events that you're interested in. Enrichment services become core, and again, one of the questions is what type of enrichment services do you want here? There's simple ones, just normalizing data, transforming data, whatever it is. But then there are more complex ones. You talked about a question was asked about sort of geolocating data. Well, you can enrich the data. If you know something about the data and you've got a city model, well, you can semantically link that piece of that data item with your city model. So there's this whole question about how much sort of linked data, semantic enrichment you want to add into the raw data that comes along with it. And then clearly above that, you need to be able to present that outside. So there's API gateways, there's real-time messaging gateways. Some of this stuff you want to access in sort of snapshot mode. Some of it you want in near real-time and real-time mode. Some of it you just want to export into other systems that are up there. And we come to the sort of consumer side. So that was the producers, right? So the consumers. So now we've got this sort of data sets pouring out of the sort of infrastructure platform, if you want. Typically, you're going to pick that up in sort of catalogs from various systems. There's going to be various systems that are going to, in a sense, curate these endpoints. And sort of London Data Store is at the moment is effectively that. It's really a curation system. It doesn't really try to do anything as such with the data. It just says, here's a data set. Here's a rich description about the data set. Go interact with the description. It doesn't really allow, other than downloading the file, that's really the only interaction with the data that you have. The rest of your interaction is with the metadata that describes the data endpoint. And there could be many of those. That could be a feature of the platform, or it could be a feature of outside other platforms that are out there. But clearly we need to pull that stuff in. Now that we're aware of data sets that represent, in some sense, are proxies for resources that are attached to the network, you want to service enable those. You want to be able to say, now that I have this data set, let's say it was whatever, the traffic walking, people walking through a particular interchange in a tube station. The type of that data set infers and implies a certain set of services. I can take that in a real live stream, near real-time mode. I can look at archival versions of that. I might be able to have tasking activities on that. So even though there's really only sort of one endpoint, it sort of implies 1 to n possible services that I might need to make available. So I make some services available, the developers come, consumers come, they look at those services, they subscribe to those services, and then they need to execute over those services, which again could be as simple as just take a file, or it could be real-time interaction, querying, filtering over data sets that are up there. So I'm not going to dwell too much on this. I'm certainly not going to read out every word on here, but there is a sense that the Dataset Catalogue, I'll sort of go through some of these things that, in a sense, are sort of improvements over what's in the London State Data Store at the moment. So the Dataset Catalogue, the metadata structure that it has is essentially a homegrown one. So there's which no bad thing, that wasn't, standards are as sort of malleable and fashionable as the wind, right? But there does seem to be an emerging set of directives from the European Commission and from other bodies that say things like the CCAN standard and Dublin Core and other sort of document semantic knowledge metadata standards are what we would like people to start adopting, primarily because it allows you to drive things like semantic querying and other statements. So that's one of the sort of improvements that we would certainly hope to get. As we said, we want to essentially service enable these endpoints. There's more that you can do with a data set and an endpoint than just download it. Why can't you query it? If you've got 12 monthly, if you've got a data set that really is published as an edition every month, and you have 3 years worth of it stored or accessible through the data store, why can't you filter on it? Why can't you ask questions of it rather than just downloading it? So the service factor is important. Provider portal, we said, one of the challenges we know that the London Data Store has at the moment is that they essentially act as the librarian for everybody else that's out there. They'd like the data set owners to act as their own librarians, their own publishers. If I've got a data set I want to publish, in theory, I should be able to just come to the provider portal on the data store, register it, tell it what type of data it's going to be, tell it how often I want to publish it, and fill in the metadata description, and that's all I need to do. So should be a low-touch, low-friction sort of system in terms of publishing. The consumer side, we've talked about that, most often consumers probably don't want to download. And when I talk about consumers in this sense, I sort of mean citizens, really. They either want to download the data set, or more probably, they want to interact with some value-added application that's been built on top of that data set, whether it's been built by a third party, or it's been built by the sort of GLA, or some other public body themselves. So there's a notion of saying, I need to be able to put applications into the store. I need to be able to have that sort of same experience that I do as a developer with the Apple Store. I need to sort of have that store-like experience over here. And that sort of comes onto the sort of developer side. You need to be able to, at some point, I think there was I can't remember who made the statement earlier today. There's whatever it is, 500 data sets on the portal at the moment. Following the Obama directive in the US, there's something close to 500,000 data sets available from public sector bodies in the US currently. Well, you can't really browse that catalog. You don't start at the top and just start scrolling down to find what you want. You need to be able to query over that metadata in a much more sort of a meaningful way in order to find the stuff that's of interest to you. And then clearly one of the challenges of that is to move that from just a sort of per data set querying to this sort of linked data. If I want to try and retrieve something that's around a more sort of semantic question than just a sort of content-driven question, I need a way to express that. Certainly there's a need for the operators to be able to operate the platform. They want to be able to review registrations, potentially even authorize them. there's lots of questions around, as I go around different cities in Europe, London has a relatively permissive policy. It sort of says, well, we don't even make people register at the moment to get the data. We don't sort of care about that level. Other cities are saying, no, we want to know exactly who's registered for access to a city, and we want to prove it. We want an approval process, particularly if they're a developer out there. And again, as you move from a just pure sort of download model to a real-time interaction model to a tasking model, well, clear at that point, the role of governance and approval and registration becomes much more important. You need a gateway to allow people to execute the sort of APIs that we're producing and to enforce whatever SLAs we want on that, whether those are throttling SLAs or preemptionless SLAs, whatever it is that's on there. And as I said, from a messaging point of view, if you start getting into real-time broadcast of the data, then you need a messaging platform to actually allow you to achieve that. And all of that is basically in scope within the sort of iCity sort of open data solution that's out there. I'm going to try and talk for another 5 minutes or more, and then we'll open it up. So what are we doing in terms of, so the way the iCity program is built is there was essentially a year of navel gazing, discovery, blah, 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 whatever you want to call it. And now they're into 2 years essentially of implementation and technology demonstration. And one of the things that we're looking at is essentially this sort of pathway which says, yeah, we'd certainly like to do a sort of proof of concept. We'd like to get some developers engaged in that process. We'd like to get some feedback around, well, what's the relative priority of some of these features that we talked about on there? And again, I'm not going to read all of this, but you can basically see, we want to do a proof of concept cycle. We certainly want to produce what in Cisco we call minimally viable products, which is the sort of least that we can do before we feel we've got sufficient functionality in there to actually deploy into sort of true production out there. Balance that with sort of GA features, differentiating or whatever you want to look at it. So that's generally the sort of program that we're looking to do. From a sort of transition standpoint, initially, we were really looking at just, as you may remember from one of the earlier slides, I talked about the sort of data catalogs for these things. There's no need for them to live inside the platform. So we're going to allow the London Data Store to just be the London Data Store sort of as it is for some period. And we will just suck in essentially a catalog of metadata descriptions and endpoint references, and then use the Service Factory and other things to create a new experience. And for those developers that want essentially API-driven access or potentially real-time access to data, they'll go through that channel. And for people that are happy with essentially the experience they're getting today, they'll just go to the London Data Store more or less as is. At some point in the future, there'll obviously be a sort of transition where everything that the London Data Store is doing can now be done by the other system. Everybody's happy that there's no risk to moving over to it, and we'll move over to that platform. That's the sort of general plan out there. Okay, here's a sort of an example, I guess, of what might be possible. And again, sort of 2 examples here. They're very quick. One is sort of saying, okay, a sort of an internal use case. Right? If I want to use this sort of Internet of Everything platform and open data sort of integration stories with a service that the city wants to offer. IOC is an incident operations center. Then typically, and this is an example from Barcelona. So Barcelona has huge issues with noise complaints, being a sort of big tourist festival type city. And currently they have because it's such a big issue with citizens, the political response to that has been every time there's a noise complaint, the police will go and investigate. We will send a car to that address. And so that's a big use of manpower for very little return as far as they see, other than political return out there. So they wanted to look at a system that said, how can we reduce that need to do essentially truck rolls of police cars out there. So deploying noise sensors and cameras, as I said, usually to some access point that's out there. You need to be able to discover that you've got these new things out there, put them into our sort of device management registry, configure them potentially, push an agent onto them if that's necessary, have them collect the events from it into your telemetry store through a gateway. It could be a messaging gateway, it could be a more regular API gateway that's out there. Wrap services around that thing, and again, tasking services, data access services. Build your IOC application so that when somebody complains, you throw something onto your bus, new complaint that's out there. Somebody gets some operator gets the need to investigate that. Well, what's the first thing they want to do? Well, the first thing they want to do is essentially locate camera and noise sensor services, sensors that are proximal to the location of the person that complained. So they can say, well, is there any correlation out there? Can I move a camera around to have a look around? That type of thing. So locating sensors, and again, how you do that from a GIS point of view, typically you'd probably have some bounding sphere around the location of the complainant, and then pull in the devices that were within that bounding sphere. As we said, some of these things allow essentially multi-person, multi-role, sort of multiple access. If you're just interested in listening to the ticks and the streams, well, multiple agents can look at that. If you want to take control of the device, well, you need to be able to take a lease out on that device, because typically that's a sort of single node activity out there. So you need to be able to manage those subscriptions over the device, and then you want to be able to control or task that device, which could be to move the sensors, it could be to change the sensitivity level of the sensors and say, yeah, okay, well, we found that, there's a noise sensor sort of 2 blocks down. Let's up the signal rate or the sensitivity of that meter, and let's listen for 10 minutes. See if we can get a correlation to this woman's complaint that's out there. If we can, well, let's now move the camera. If there's a camera we can move, let's move the camera and take a look around. So that's the type of scenarios that people are looking at, and then saying, okay, well, we've got these sort of things pouring off the platform. We need to throw them onto a message bus. We need to give them back to the IOC in order to allow the operator to review either archival streams from those sensors or the real-time data coming off those sensors. And then eventually, we need to be able to allow that same data to be sent to those sort of mobile devices that are, typically in this instance, a police car, in order for them to be able to aware of exactly the same data streams that the incident investigator is actually seeing inside the control room. So this is the type of scenario that some of the cities inside the iCity group are looking at. So yeah, this is the problem. We see that sort of Internet of Everything platform, open infrastructure, open data sort of solution helping us address out there. If you look at a sort of co-creation type model, which is, again, I think there was a reference to this morning in that, lots of European cities have pedestrian areas where the access to the pedestrian street is controlled by bollards, by automated bollards, and typically the only vehicles that are allowed on there are like garbage collection, police cars, that type of thing. What they'd like to be able to do, particularly in cities where there's a traffic issue and moving a tourist around issue, is essentially to go through the same thing, which is say, okay, we've got a system that controls these things, well, let's make that system available to third parties. So again, basically you go through the same sort of process. You need to discover the fact where all these bollards are, and when new ones appear, you need to be able to configure them appropriately. You need to be able to wrap it in a service, and then you've got some third party out here. My taxi application company needs to be able to discover that those APIs exist, wants to be able to subscribe to those APIs, and then wants to build an application that they then sell to taxi drivers to say, here you go. Here's something that allows you, if you drive up to the bollard, you can click this button on your iPhone or whatever the device is that's providing the application, and if you've got the right set of entitlements, we'll let the bollard come down and you can drive down the street that's out there. And again, there's sorts of various issues that sort of get involved in this. And again, it really comes back to, ultimately, it's not just about being able to read data off of these sort of subsystems. It's actually being able to control them, to task them in some sense, is really, you get to the ultimate sort of goal for out there. There's lots of issues here. This was actually, again, I think this is a Barcelona example. Their challenge was here when there's really two sort of users of the system. There's the developer who's building the application. They want to control and authorize that. They want to say, yeah, you have a right to build an application over this service. When that developer then sells, which I'm assuming they will probably do rather than give away for free, sells that application to an end user, a taxi driver, the city said, well, we want to authorize them as well. So in a sense, you end up with two sets of keys and entitlements that need to be managed at the point of execution, which is the person the service provider, in this sense, the sort of software development company, and the service user, service consumer, which happens to be a taxi driver. And then to actually then combine that entitlement for those two users with a set of policies that say, well, maybe you can only do this between, rush hour. It's not rush hour, we don't want you to do it. You can drive around the regular streets. You only get to use the shortcuts in rush hour. So there's all sorts of policy questions and saying, how do you communicate, promote, and manage those sort of policy questions that sort of come up out of this. I'm going to rush through a few use cases. I'm not really going to, again, read them out, but just to give a sort of breadth of some of the things that we get to hear here, which is, citizen complaints we sort of touched on. This is an interesting one, sort of urban renewal. There were lots of challenges. When you start talking about cameras, people get really antsy, as you would imagine, about saying we want to give access to cameras and such like. But one of the scenarios where putting cameras in place seemed to be attractive was in sort of urban renewal projects, where actually what the camera is doing is really watching the contractor to say, are they working between hours of X and Y, but are they complying with the bounds of their permit? If their permit says, you need to put bollards up here, you need to deal with the dust, you need to make sure you haven't got piles of dirt 5 yards out into the road. Currently, the city has to send people around periodically, every hour, 3 hours, whatever it is, when they get a complaint, to make sure that contractors are complying with the bounds of those permits. So one of the suggestions by the city, well, if we can have a sort of, I don't know if you have them here, but I'm sure you do, those sort of like things that the police put by the side of the road to measure your speed, and they say you are driving at 25 miles an hour in a 30-mile-an-hour zone. It's sort of like having those sort of mobile signage type things, but now they've got cameras on, they've got air quality sensors, environmental sensors, a noise sensor, a dust sensor, or whatever. And so the city manager, whoever is responsible for that project, can essentially manage the compliance of the contractor with the limits of their permits and their expectations of working hours and working environment without actually having to go to visit. Just watch them, essentially, that's out there. So that was a scenario that sort of came out of that. Energy management, as I said, that's a very sort of core sort of, oh yeah, that's an obvious problem. Let's go fix that problem. And you talk about things like street lights in the buildings, in homes. Street lights is an interesting one. We've heard about scenarios where it's a big, the power that powers street lights is a big cost for most cities. So lots of cities are saying, well, how can we switch lights off? We just want to switch lights off. And then actually have them be aware of, either because they can sense people, traffic, whatever it is, or because there's a means for the person to say, I'm going to walk down that street, or I'm going to walk from this building to my car parking spot, to then have the lights turn on and turn off, either in a cadence or follow them. Again, lots of personal, psychological issues and behavioral issues around some of those things. But those are the sorts of things that people are looking at and saying, and again, it sort of comes back to, what's the purpose of all of this? Is the purpose of all this just to make money, save money? Or is it to, what's the human benefit and the human outcomes that people actually desire through all this digital sort of behaviors that are out there? Personal safety. Again, it's not just, as I touched out earlier, it's not really just the urban environment that is instrumented. We're all instrumented in some way, shape, or form. Our homes are instrumented in some way. Offices are particularly currently. So it's saying, okay, can you use all this in some way to drive and manage and model behaviors? For example, in the States, again, I'm sure most people are aware of, the States is healthcare is paid for by insurance. And one of the biggest contributors to the rising expense of that is drug companies and the cost of drugs. So there's a movement by the health providers to say to the drug companies to say, no, we're going to stop paying for prescription, we're going to pay for outcome. If you tell us that if we give this drug to this person, it will clear their condition in 10 days, 3 weeks, whatever it is, and it doesn't, you don't get paid. The converse to that is the drug company saying, okay, if you want to charge us on that basis, we want to start making sure people are following an optimal treatment regime. Taking drugs when we tell them they should take drugs. If we say you need to take it 4 hours after food, well, we want to know that they can do that. And so there are, and again, I think it's touched on in one of the other sessions, there are smart pills. There are pills that have chips in. There are pills that you can take that now can sort of express to a monitoring system, which could be a phone, that you took the pill, you took it at this time of day, and it seems to be having some beneficial effect out there. So, there's lots of issues around, as I said, how do you look at these things and say, is this a positive benefit or a negative benefit? Is it snooping, or is it intrusion, or is it helpful? Is it going to help me get better, or is it going to help me get worse? Am I going to feel better about it, feel worse about it? Who owns the data? Blah, blah, blah. Lots of challenges and issues around this. Building permits we touched on a little bit earlier. Out there, so I won't dwell with that. So where are we at? Well, mainly where we're at is lots of questions. Yeah, it's pretty simple. The technology around sort of putting these systems together is actually not that complex, right? The networks exist, things get attached to the network, they ping, you can store stuff. It's a lot around what's the point and what's the purpose, and what is needed to turn this from a sort of research, academic, hobby type experience into a real experience, a citywide experience that's out there. So, some of the topics I got up here is, okay, well, are we actually is the right data being provided? And if it isn't, what is the data that developers want? Clearly at the moment, if you look at the London data set, there's sort of statistical demographic data coming, and there's sort of data coming off of the TfL. Is that it? Is that all that people in London require, or what else is there out there? Where are the opportunities? And by that I really mean, where are the sort of low-hanging sort of opportunities that are out there? What makes a difference? If I provided this data and somebody built an app, does that make a difference? Or is it just, yeah, it's another sort of 5-minute wonder of iPhone app that somebody downloads, plays with for a week and forgets, that's out there? Who makes money? Should anybody make any money? One of the reasons why in the States you're seeing sort of interest in this from the cities, and again it's slightly different, is most cities in the States are funded by property tax revenues. And property tax revenues are flat and declining because of the issues around the housing market and the desire to avoid an inflation-driven housing market. And because they don't work on a rating system, the value of a house only changes when a transaction occurs. So if it's not a highly mobile housing market, then revenues stay very flat. If you bought a house in Palo Alto or somewhere in California 20 years ago for $100,000, well, your property tax is $1,000 a year, 1%. That house might be worth $5 million now, or $2 million. Doesn't change until somebody buys it out there. So they're looking at this and saying, is this an opportunity for us to shift revenue generation away from this sort of property tax, sales tax-based model into a service creation? people seem quite happy to pay $5 for the most ridiculous applications and then to pay a ton of money for in-app purchases and per transaction services. Can the city take a piece of that? Should the city take a piece of that? I think Nick earlier talked about, well, what's the role of enterprise data, of private data in this? We talked about patterns, we talked about semantic enrichment, linked data. What's the sort of relative priority of those around just getting data that's out there? And there's relatively limited standards in this, right? Even around, you ask the question that says, okay, if I've got this data coming from a system inside the city and I want to link it to a GIS system, well, what's the right standard for me to be aware of as a platform? Is it City GML? Is it this? Is that? There's sort of limited standards out there. So what standards are important? So I'll sort of stop there. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending. At 6 o'clock, I believe there's drinks and networking opportunities downstairs. It's been a very interesting discussion, and we'd certainly welcome following up with people with their questions and opportunities and discuss further. Thank you very much.